During the frozen white abyss of February 1899, when thermometers in Colorado's rugged San Luis Valley plunged to record-breaking lows never before witnessed by living memory, the howling wind transformed into an unseen executioner. Magnificent estates were swiftly reduced to little more than wooden tombs. The wealthiest and most influential men of the county, residing in their arrogant two-story mansions boasting expensive glass windows shipped all the way from the East Coast, watched in absolute horror as their loved ones shivered inconsolably beneath every single blanket they owned. Beyond those walls, the natural world was proving that it holds zero regard for vast fortunes or fancy property deeds. Livestock perished right where they stood, freezing upright like macabre statues made of flesh. The chill was so profound, so absolute and unnatural, that massive trees across the valley would literally explode in the dead of night, echoing like rifle shots due to the violent expansion of ice trapped inside their trunks. Yet, on the outskirts of the settlement, sitting upon a barren plot of land that every other pioneer had sneered at, stood an odd, low-slung structure featuring unusually thick walls that seemed to sprout straight out of the earth itself. Tucked away inside that sanctuary, a 62-year-old man slumbered peacefully, wrapped in nothing but a single hand-woven blanket, his cheeks flushed with warmth and his fingertips perfectly toasty. He went by the name of Don Mateo, and practically everyone in that booming town had confidently predicted his demise. To fully comprehend how this unassuming figure managed to conquer nature's wrath while the haughty faced their doom, we need to rewind the clock by 6 months. Right in the middle of the summer of 1898, Mateo had trekked into the San Luis Valley on foot. He was an individual whose face had been weathered by decades of unforgiving sunshine, bearing hands as rough as aged rawhide, and carrying a heavy grief in his soul that he never bothered to articulate. He had lost his former ranch along with his entire family to a catastrophic fire further down south in New Mexico. Presently, he found himself wandering through a region that had once belonged to his forefathers, but where shifting borders had ultimately turned him into an outsider. He arrived with barely anything more than an exhausted mule, a handful of iron tools, and exactly $15 tucked away in a tiny leather pouch. The settlement of Esperanza, situated right in the heart of the valley, was far from welcoming to newcomers, let alone an elderly Hispanic gentleman showing up with zero wealth and no local backing. The moment Mateo hitched his mule outside the town's sole general store, hoping to stake a claim on a forsaken piece of land, a heavy, hostile silence descended upon the area, dropping like a massive block of granite. The suit-clad gentleman simply stared down at his dust-covered boots. High society ladies from the area tightened their shawls and turned their noses up with unmistakable disdain. It was Mr. Silas Montgomery who finally opted to shatter the quiet. Silas stood out as the wealthiest banker and cattle baron in the region, a fellow who loved bragging about his sprawling, white-painted wooden home featuring a genuine wraparound porch. He cast an imposing figure, possessing a habit of standing with his thumbs hooked behind his suspenders, looking as though he were perpetually posing for a photograph. Utilizing a tone dripping with arrogance, he looked the old man up and down. He informed him that this particular valley was no place for someone of his years and standing, implying that the harshness of the mountains would chew him up before he ever managed to harvest a single crop, and heavily suggested that the smartest move would be heading back south to beg for handouts. Mateo refused to break eye contact. Clenching his calloused hands, he replied in a calm yet unwavering voice that echoed against the wooden walls of the store, stating that the South held absolutely nothing for him anymore. He pointed out that the law granted any hard-working fellow the right to claim a plot of dirt, so long as he possessed the stamina to work it. Right at that instant, Jebediah Cross, the county's most highly regarded master builder and carpenter, let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Jebediah was a burly individual who erected stone and timber residences for the affluent elite, and he thoroughly despised any construction technique that wasn't pulled directly from European guidebooks. He openly ridiculed Mateo in front of the crowd, telling him that at his advanced age, his bones would simply snap trying to hoist a support beam, and predicting that the valley's initial winter gale would blow away whatever pathetic shack he tried to throw together, sending him to an early grave before the first flakes even fell. Joining in on the mockery was Reverend Josiah Blackwood, the spiritual shepherd of the community. A towering, strict figure, he was the sort who gauged folks' religious devotion by the thickness of their wallets and the sheer size of their tithing. Adopting a tone of fake piety, he advised Mateo that pride was a terrible sin, adding that attempting to endure alone in such unforgiving country was a presumptuous affront to God's will. Mateo felt something harden deep within his chest. It wasn't anger. Rather, it was a far more ancient power, an unspoken wisdom passed down from his grandparents, who had instructed him since childhood that the earth could act as a mother when humanity ultimately refused to do so. He thanked the trio for their concern with flawless politeness, yet boldly declared, without a hint of hesitation, that he intended to stay put. Silas, Jebediah, and the Reverend traded knowing glances that silently communicated their shared belief that this foolish old man wouldn't even survive to see October. If you happen to believe that the knowledge of our elders holds more value than the ego of modern folks, consider joining us. We are currently busy rescuing the very tales that history has actively tried to erase. Paying absolutely no mind to the whispers behind his back, Mateo secured the deed to the land nobody else desired. It was a wind-battered strip of acreage where the soil felt as solid as bedrock and plant life was practically non-existent. It proved to be the only spot affordable for a fellow lacking financial backing, a patch of dirt that even the most desperate pioneers flatly rejected. Out there, enveloped by the valley's boundless isolation, Mateo didn't start chopping down timber or ordering pricey bricks he couldn't possibly afford. Instead, he patiently waited until the major valley farmers wrapped up their wheat harvests toward the tail end of summer. Those agricultural men viewed the thick stalks of leftover wheat as nothing more than useless trash. They would bind them into massive rectangular bundles, essentially dry straw bales, and either leave them to rot in the rain or torch them just to clear the fields. Mateo hitched up his mule to a borrowed wagon and began gathering up all that discarded straw. He journeyed back and forth day after day, baking beneath the scorching sun, stacking hundreds of these golden blocks of compressed hay right onto his property. Once his mountain of bales grew sufficiently large, he kicked off the solitary, back-breaking labor of actual construction. His architectural blueprint was an innovation so incredibly old that modern society had entirely forgotten it, or even worse, dismissed it as backward. Mateo was aiming to build a straw bale dwelling, featuring massive walls nearly 3 feet thick, stacking them up as though they were oversized bricks. Jebediah, the seasoned contractor, happened to be rolling down the dirt road in his fancy carriage and reined in his horses for the sole purpose of heckling. Spotting the senior citizen erecting walls made of dried grass, he hollered out that the old-timer was clearly losing whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. He shouted that civilized folks put up structures using timber or masonry, warning that at the very first serious gust of wind, his pasture house would go flying into the sky. Or worse yet, a single stray spark would burn him to cinders while he slept. He reiterated loudly that he was fixing to live just like a wild beast. Mateo, never dropping the heavy bale he was currently hauling, wiped the perspiration from his brow and patiently replied that critters tend to endure bitter winters far better than human beings do. Jebediah simply shook his head, muttering that it was going to be his own funeral, and kept driving, spreading the gossip all across town that the old Mexican fellow was busy building a giant bird's nest to live inside. However, what the snooty carpenter completely failed to grasp was the profound science, the sheer natural engineering that Mateo was actively utilizing. Due to being so densely packed together, straw bales managed to trap millions of microscopic pockets of air deep inside. And trapped, stagnant air remains, even to this very day, one of the most flawless and highly effective thermal insulators known to exist anywhere on the globe. Nevertheless, Mateo had absolutely no intention of leaving that straw vulnerable to the harsh elements or potential fire hazards. He recalled the teachings handed down by his grandmother. He remembered exactly how she, utilizing hands that resembled rough tree bark, used to knead the raw dirt. She had long ago taught him that the earth never fights back against you, but rather, it embraces and shields you. Mateo proceeded to dig a massive pit. He blended the valley's distinct red clay alongside sand, water from a nearby creek, and horse manure that he had patiently gathered straight from the local trails. He stomped through this concoction barefoot for several days straight, eventually yielding a thick, perfectly elastic adobe mud. Using nothing but his bare hands, he started slathering the interior and exterior of the straw walls with remarkably thick layers of this living clay. His palms, despite already being deeply calloused, took a beating from the constant friction. He developed nasty blisters that eventually burst open, effectively mixing his own blood right into the earthen plaster. His back muscles burned every single evening with an exhausting fire, yet the structure continued to rise. As it baked solid beneath the late summer sun, the adobe morphed into an armor plating as tough as solid rock. The straw ended up completely sealed away within an oxygen-starved vacuum, rendering it entirely fireproof while creating a barricade immune to the absolute fiercest gales. On the inside, the earthen plaster functioned as an enormous thermal mass. The underlying physics represented an ancestral secret. Those very walls would soak up the heat generated by the fireplace and the daytime sun, trapping it right in the clay, only to steadily radiate it back out throughout the freezing nights, holding a perfectly stable temperature that totally ignored whatever the weather was doing outside. For his main heating setup, Mateo burned through a massive chunk of his meager savings, shelling out $2 for a rusted-out metal drum. However, he didn't just hook it up like some standard parlor stove, the kind that shoots all the beneficial warmth straight up the flue and out into the sky. Mateo decided to construct a rocket mass heater. He routed the barrel's exhaust pipe right through a lengthy bench crafted from adobe and river stones, running it securely along the interior wall before finally venting it through the roof. By doing this, the scorching exhaust gases were forced to travel horizontally through that mud and stone bench, surrendering every last ounce of their thermal energy into the physical structure long before escaping outdoors. Whenever Mateo sparked a tiny blaze, that entire seating area would get toasty, transforming into a gargantuan radiator that would project a gentle, unwavering, and almost healing warmth for over 24 hours, relying on little more than a handful of kindling or dried scrub oak. While the elderly man toiled away in total silence, hands caked in dirt, but sporting a completely serene expression, dead in the center of Esperanza, sheer arrogance was actively dictating all the local building codes. Silas Montgomery decided to expand his Victorian mansion by tacking on soaring vaulted ceilings and gigantic glass panes facing due north, essentially daring Mother Nature to do her worst, just for the sake of looking fancy. Jebediah Cross threw up a massive, imposing solid stone home, conveniently ignoring the fact that solid rock acts as the ultimate thermal bridge, eagerly sucking up the winter chill and transferring it straight into the living quarters. The resulting contrast was absolutely brutal. On one end of the spectrum, you had fortunes blown on intricately carved lumber, iron nails, and imported brick fireplaces that practically gobbled up lumber by the ton. On the exact opposite end, you had $14 spent, mixed with elbow grease, mud, trashed pasture grass, and the profound humility of a guy who fully grasped that the world isn't conquered by brute force, but understood through quiet observation. By the time October rolled around, that bizarre little dwelling featuring thick walls and smoothed, rounded edges was officially complete, and that's exactly when nature, dark and utterly relentless, started mailing out its initial warning signs. The month of November ushered in a gale that shrieked across the San Luis Valley, much like a ravenous wolf pack descending from the high peaks. Come nightfall, Don Mateo could actually hear those gusts slamming into the distant wooden homes of the town, easily picturing how they made the floorboards groan and how the draft whistled a macabre tune through every unsealed crack. Inside his own sanctuary of straw bales and heavy mud, however, that same wind sounded like nothing more than a faraway rumor, a heavily muffled whisper choked out by nearly 3 feet of all-natural insulation. The magnificent estates belonging to the valley's most prosperous figures began exposing their fatal flaws long before the very first heavy snowfall even hit the ground. Mr. Silas Montgomery, pacing around his sprawling, high-ceilinged Victorian mansion, was burning through an absolute fortune in firewood, furiously stoking 3 distinct hearths just to keep the interior temperature barely tolerable. Physics, however, is incredibly cruel to ignorance. The heated air simply rushed straight up the flues and vanished completely into the nighttime sky. Any bedrooms located far away from the open flames turned absolutely glacial, feeling as frigid as solid marble. Over at Jebediah Cross's imposing stone manor, the situation looked even more incredibly grim. That massive masonry eagerly soaked up the outdoor chill and actively radiated it straight indoors. His wife eventually developed a nagging, deep, and incredibly painful cough, entirely due to sleeping in a bedroom constantly swept by freezing drafts that seemed to casually phase right through the very walls. The absolute only fix they could come up with was trying to seal those gorgeous window panes using old newspapers and damp rags, materials that swiftly froze solid. Meanwhile, over at Reverend Blackwood's place, they quickly discovered that their elegant brick fireplace harbored a downright deadly design flaw. Whenever the gales blew out of the north, the toxic exhaust would backdraft straight into the parlor instead of venting properly. They spent 3 whole days with watering eyes, violently hacking up soot, before the good Reverend finally confessed, nursing a bruised ego, that they desperately required outside help just to survive inside their own home. Jebediah, serving as the local expert, declared that they desperately needed an expensive draft deflector cap that wouldn't even be delivered until springtime. They were effectively trapped inside snares they had built themselves. In the meantime, Don Mateo was happily residing inside his humble straw and adobe home, enjoying a level of quiet that bordered on the surreal. Every single evening at dusk, he would spark a short, incredibly fast, and blisteringly hot fire inside his metal barrel, utilizing nothing more than a few dried sprigs of scrub oak alongside some random valley brush. The blaze would roar intensely for about an hour, pushing the dense, scalding smoke right through the metal flue buried deep within his lengthy earthen bench. Right around the 1-hour mark, the flames would completely die out. But the sheer miracle of that ancestral thermal mass was literally just warming up. That heavy seat, constructed of mud and river rock, gobbled up all that thermal energy. Throughout the entirety of the night, the giant bench would beam a gentle, deeply penetrating, infrared warmth into absolutely every corner of the dwelling. The interior heat held perfectly steady at around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, just brisk enough to keep you from sweating, yet entirely cozy if you were wearing a flannel shirt and heavy socks. There wasn't a single treacherous draft to be found. There were 0 midnight creaks from lumber actively fighting against its very own nature. Furthermore, Mateo's highly modest food stash, consisting of dried beans, corn, and jerky, stretched infinitely further than anticipated, mainly because his aging body wasn't burning through vital calories just to constantly shiver. Right around mid-December, sheer skepticism forced Silas Montgomery to saddle up his horse and ride directly over to Mateo's plot. He showed up completely unannounced, bundled tightly in a heavy imported wool coat, his nose glowing red from the biting chill. He desperately wanted to witness firsthand exactly how terribly the old Mexican fellow was suffering inside his muddy bird's nest. Mateo, utilizing that deeply ingrained politeness characteristic of his heritage, warmly invited the man inside. The exact second Silas stepped across the threshold, and that heavy, rustic wooden door clicked shut behind him. His entire frame visibly slackened, as it was immediately enveloped by the cozy heat. Silas glanced around the room, absolutely baffled. There wasn't a single roaring blaze crackling inside a hearth. There were 0 massive stacks of split firewood lying around. It was just an elderly guy resting on a curved clay seating area, casually sipping some herbal tea. Silas peeled off his heavy riding gloves and pressed his palm against the earthen plaster covering the hay. It was remarkably warm to the touch. It honestly felt as though the structure itself were somehow alive, steadily exhaling pure warmth. Thoroughly bewildered and nursing a slightly bruised ego, Silas demanded to know how this was even physically possible. Mateo, flashing a highly tranquil smile, explained that his forefathers understood perfectly well that the soil is never our enemy, but rather it operates by its own distinct set of rules. He mentioned that if you actually bother to listen to it, rather than constantly trying to force it into submission, it can easily serve as the most formidable shield on earth. Silas simply remained dead silent, happily soaking up the ambient heat for 20 lengthy minutes. When he finally took his leave, he didn't utter a single word of apology. Yet his eyes no longer held any trace of mockery, just a profound, terribly confused sense of respect. The true winter, the outright catastrophe destined to completely wipe that local arrogance right off the map, finally touched down in early February of 1899. It certainly didn't roll in gradually like some well-mannered houseguest. It crashed down much like outright divine retribution. That specific day kicked off with a graveyard-like stillness settling over the San Luis Valley. All the local wildlife actively retreated deep down into their respective burrows. The skyline took on a sickly, leaden hue that the indigenous folks of the area instantly recognized for what it was. By high noon, the mercury had plummeted at a truly terrifying rate. Right around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavens literally split wide open. These certainly weren't delicate little snowflakes spiraling gracefully down to earth. They were legitimate needles of solid ice, launched perfectly horizontally by hurricane-force gusts that caused sturdy 2-story structures to shake violently right down to their foundations. Come 6 in the evening, outdoor visibility was an absolute 0. The entire world had morphed into one continuous roar, a murderous white vortex where taking a single step past your own front door meant getting instantly lost and expiring within minutes. This was the legendary blizzard that ended up slaughtering livestock, stretching all the way from the high plains straight down to the southern basins. Over at Silas Montgomery's opulent estate, that gale expertly located every single tiny flaw hiding within his luxury woodwork. Silas and his hired hands fed firewood into the flames at an incredibly alarming pace throughout that very first night. The extreme freeze, however, simply overpowered the roaring fires. Pitcher water resting inside their gorgeous porcelain jugs began to freeze completely solid. Not outside at the well, mind you, but sitting right there inside their very own bedrooms. His wife openly wept in pure desperation as she watched thick sheets of frost rapidly forming along the interior of the window panes. Over inside Jebediah Cross's stone fortress, the ambient temperature nosedived dramatically. That solid rock essentially functioned like one colossal block of ice. His spouse, already battling illness, started hacking up faint traces of blood. Jebediah, the very guy who genuinely believed he could conquer the mountains using nothing but a chisel and hammer, suddenly realized he couldn't even manage to heat up his own architectural masterpiece. The absolute best he could manage was wrapping his wife tightly in every available quilt and sending up a desperate prayer. Down at Reverend Blackwood's residence, that persistent chimney backdraft effectively forced the family to extinguish their only fire smack in the middle of a lethal storm. The raw chill seeped straight down into his family's very bones. His young children's feet began to swell, taking on a dangerously dark, purplish hue. The man who always operated on absolute certainties abruptly discovered the sheer limits of his own ego when stacked up against the unbreakable laws of thermodynamics. Out in the elements, the mercury bottomed out at 40 degrees below zero on the second night. Silas's purebred cattle simply froze to death out in the pastures, left standing upright like macabre lawn ornaments. It was a deadly freeze that actively paralyzed lungs and swiftly brought on severe frostbite. Yet, out on the fringes of town, safely tucked inside that peculiar home with its chunky walls and smooth corners, Don Mateo sat in absolute peace, stitching together a leather harness by the flicker of a tallow candle. The temperature lingering inside his sanctuary of straw bales and mud remained perfectly steady, unshakable. Outdoors, thermometers registered digits capable of extinguishing life in a matter of minutes. However, the dense insulation provided by that compacted hay, tightly sealed by the earth itself, served as an impenetrable barrier that no amount of wealth could ever hope to replicate. That enormous adobe seating area, fired up with merely an armful of scrap lumber, positively glowed with deep, radiating infrared warmth. There were zero drafts, no deadly whistles desperately trying to sneak through unsealed cracks. There was nothing but pure silence, profound peace, and sheer survival. Mateo dined on a hearty bowl of bean soup mixed with beef jerky, without experiencing a single shiver. Defying every single odds and all the vicious predictions swirling around town, the elderly Mexican man was doing absolutely fine. It wasn't until the third night of the blizzard that something fundamental finally shattered deep within the souls of those influential men. Silas Montgomery, watching his own family huddled up and quivering beneath a mountain of quilts right next to totally useless fireplaces, was struck by a realization that humiliated him to his very core. That senior citizen they had so easily discarded possessed knowledge that they, armed with all their cash and formal schooling, entirely lacked. Jebediah Cross, listening to his wife actively struggling for air, suddenly recalled Mateo's remark about how the earth embraces and shields you. At the break of dawn on the fourth day, the tempest granted a brief, incredibly deceptive lull. The gales temporarily died down, leaving behind a truly terrifying quiet. And during that tiny window, sheer desperation accomplished what refined upbringing simply could not. Peering through a heavily frosted pane of glass, Silas spotted a thin, crisp, and incredibly peaceful plume of white smoke rising straight from Mateo's acreage. Without even coordinating amongst themselves, Silas trailing his family, Jebediah physically carrying his ailing wife, and the Reverend essentially dragging his young kids, stepped out into the waist-deep powder, trudging with extreme difficulty straight toward the old man's property. They halted roughly 20 paces shy of that heavy wooden door, unconsciously forming a semicircle of absolute and total defeat. They were teetering right on the very brink of hypothermia. It was Silas who finally broke the silence, and those words likely cost him far more than every single acre of his sprawling ranch combined. He admitted, his voice cracking noticeably, that his loved ones were freezing to death, noting that the walls of his palatial home had essentially turned into solid ice. Jebediah, the imposing giant of local construction, hung his head low and confessed that his bride desperately required genuine warmth. Otherwise, he was bound to lose her before sunset. The Reverend, completely abandoning his long-winded sermons, opted to simply utter the most powerful word imaginable. Please. Don Mateo was a fellow who had been stripped of absolutely everything. Folks had treated him like an uneducated fool. They had essentially sentenced him to perish out in the bitter cold. Those very men had wagered heavily against his survival with the secret, smug satisfaction reserved for those who believe they're naturally superior. This represented his absolutely perfect opportunity. The golden chance to hurl every single insult and sneer right back in their faces, to simply slam the door shut and allow that unforgiving winter to finally collect the toll for their monumental arrogance. Instead, Don Mateo pulled open that heavy oak door and gently stated, "Come on in. We've got plenty of room for everybody." The sheer wave of heat that hit them upon crossing that threshold felt remarkably like being reborn into an entirely different dimension. This wasn't the harsh, smoky blast typical of a desperate campfire. It was a dense, incredibly stable, and almost maternal warmth. It felt exactly like the sensation of being welcomed and silently forgiven. The old man carefully settled the ailing women and the severely shivering children directly atop that lengthy, healing adobe bench. The gentleman simply remained standing, furiously brushing the heavy layers of frost right off their heavy coats. Mateo quickly heated up a fresh pot of tea and passed around some of his bread. There wasn't a single lecture given. Nobody uttered even a hint of an "I told you so." Inside the rounded confines of a dwelling slapped together using farming trash, the sheer quiet spoke volumes about actual redemption. Silas's wife, finally feeling the blood begin to pump back into her frozen fingers, broke down weeping bitterly. She whispered a desperate plea for God to forgive them all for ever labeling him a crazy old fool. Mateo, gently stirring a small kettle, simply assured her that none of that mattered anymore, and he was telling the absolute truth. Jebediah, the masterful builder, kept stroking that toasty clay wall as if he were actively attempting to crack some divine equation that had eluded him his entire career. He confessed aloud that structurally, this whole setup shouldn't even work. Yet it was performing infinitely better than anything he'd ever erected during his 30-year tenure. Mateo took a seat and laid it all out for him. It works precisely because it refuses to fight back. Timber constantly battles the gales. Masonry goes to war against the ice, and glass panes desperately attempt to divide two separate worlds. However, the dirt, the hay, and the mud simply exist, and through their totally peaceful existence, they actively preserve life. Reverend Blackwood, watching his kids finally sleeping soundly for the first time in practically a week, confessed with a broken voice that he'd been preaching about genuine humility for decades, yet he'd never actually grasped what it truly meant until that very second. The blizzard inevitably returned that afternoon, bringing with it an atrocious vengeance. Outside, the blinding whiteout actively buried rooftops, yet safely tucked behind those walls nearly 3 feet thick. The environment remained toasty, secure, and incredibly hushed. The affluent baron and the forgotten outcast happily shared the exact same pocket of heated air. The master carpenter and the lowly peasant sat down right on the exact same level. For 3 solid days, Mateo kept feeding his rocket mass heater with methodical precision, utilizing nothing more than a few scattered handfuls of twigs. That bench, crafted from river rock and mud, simply soaked up those brief bursts of flame and beamed pure life right back out into the room. By the time the tempest finally exhaled its dying breath and the sun peeked back out over a completely devastated landscape that now resembled a frozen white desert, those families stepped out of Mateo's door, much like shipwreck survivors finally hitting dry land. The entire valley looked utterly unrecognizable. Silas's ridiculously lavish horse barn had entirely caved in beneath the crushing weight of the accumulated drifts, essentially flattening everything trapped underneath. That massive stone manor had its expensive glass panes completely blown out by the sheer pressure of the expanding ice, and the whole structure looked like it was dangerously close to crumbling. Yet, Mateo's bizarrely rounded little dwelling sat completely intact. Safely tucked beneath its snowy blanket, those incredibly thick straw and mud walls had weathered the crushing forces of the gale and ice without so much as flinching. Mother Earth had officially triumphed right where deep pockets and modern industry had failed in catastrophic fashion. Silas Montgomery firmly shook Mateo's heavily calloused hand, and buried within that genuinely sincere grip were far more apologies than you could fit into 1,000 speeches. Jebediah Cross, actively shedding his massive ego for good, showed back up the very next week, carrying a completely blank notepad. He practically begged the elderly Hispanic man to teach him everything entirely from scratch. He was desperate to study proper airflow, the intricacies of packing straw, and the actual mechanics of thermal mass. By the time the following spring rolled around, the San Luis Valley was already beginning to transform. 3 fresh families officially decided to ditch the pricey lumber and instead threw up structures featuring widened walls and softened edges, specifically designed to embrace the local climate. Jebediah quickly morphed into a totally tireless evangelist, pushing for natural building methods all across the county. And absolutely every time somebody complimented his craftsmanship, he would always, without fail, pass the credit squarely to Don Mateo, reminding folks that the very guy they'd labeled insane was the one who kept them all breathing. The subsequent years proved to be incredibly generous. Mateo was no longer isolated. The entire settlement of Esperanza finally figured out that social borders and nasty prejudices die off incredibly fast the moment extreme cold comes knocking. Silas ended up gifting him a flock of premium sheep, which absolutely thrived inside the cozy earthen pens Mateo personally designed for them. Jebediah went ahead and crafted him the most exquisite furniture that solid oak could possibly yield, acting as a token of his eternal gratitude. Mateo managed to live well into his twilight years, inside the very home he hoisted up with his own 2 hands, harboring the deep satisfaction of watching the valley slowly fill up with gentle roof lines and clay walls, forging an entirely new way of living that paid homage to ancient know-how without totally dismissing the future. Right up until his final days, he fully understood that genuine wealth doesn't actually lie within towering walls, erected purely to flex power, but rather in the profound wisdom of allowing yourself to be cradled by the very dirt we walk upon. Tales exactly like Don Mateo's serve to remind us of a truly vital lesson. Quiet observation and pure humility are worth 100 times more than all the gold buried deep in the mountains. They teach us that the profound knowledge held by our elders, those grandparents who worked hand in hand with Mother Nature, harbors life-saving truths that modern arrogance constantly chooses to ignore entirely at its own peril. Ego is the ultimate silent killer. It manages to freeze your very soul long before the initial snowflake ever hits the ground. If this particular account regarding the victory of the underdog, the harsh punishment of the arrogant, and the ultimate triumph of ancestral ingenuity, clashing with the sheer fury of the elements, has managed to touch your heart, drop a like and hit subscribe. Go ahead and share it with someone who might desperately need a quick reminder that in a society utterly obsessed with building taller and infinitely more expensive structures, sometimes the most massive victory lies in simply returning to our roots and listening a little more closely. Never, ever label a person crazy simply because they manage to spot the very solutions that you, blinded by your own pride, cannot yet fathom. However, the tale of that historic blizzard definitely didn't wrap up the exact morning the skies finally cleared. The history textbooks and the official Colorado meteorological records certainly remember the winter of 1899 as a deeply scarring event. But for the 14 folks actively hunkered down inside Don Mateo's tiny, rounded abode, those trapped days quickly morphed into the absolute greatest lesson of their entire lives. The physical rescue mission had effectively already concluded, yet the spiritual rescue, the total transformation of those incredibly arrogant gentlemen, demanded time, silence, and the utterly overwhelming evidence provided by nature itself. For a solid 7 days following the massive tempest, the San Luis Valley remained totally impassable. The powder had actively formed pristine white dunes easily topping 10 feet high, completely burying roads, fence lines, and any lingering hopes of travel. Attempting to leave Mateo's acreage was entirely impossible, acting as a literal death sentence by way of frostbite. And so the millionaire banker, the master carpenter, the stern reverend, along with their respective families, had to quickly learn how to peacefully cohabitate within a footprint of barely 400 square feet, alongside the very guy they had actively marginalized. That tiny circular dwelling smelled strongly of parched earth, fresh sage tea, and the faint, distinctly sweet smoke of burning oak. It presented a remarkably primitive, yet deeply maternal aroma, Silas Montgomery, a guy entirely accustomed to dining upon mahogany tables shipped straight from Europe, found himself parked directly on a packed dirt floor, splitting a highly modest pewter bowl filled with black beans. There were 0 hired servants. No fancy silver cutlery in sight. There was nothing but pure hunger mixed with intense gratitude. Silas quietly observed his own wife, a proper high society lady who historically fainted over the slightest inconvenience, now sleeping incredibly peacefully on a basic canvas cot, curled up snugly right near the toasty adobe seating. The violent shivering had completely vanished. Proper color had officially returned to her cheeks. It was during those exceptionally lengthy nights trapped indoors, illuminated by nothing more than the flickering orange glow spilling from the rocket mass heater, when the sheer arrogance officially crumbled away, eagerly making room for genuine curiosity. Jebediah Cross, completely unable to catch a wink of sleep, kept wandering over toward the dwelling's walls. He would repeatedly drag his massive carpenter's hands across the heavily textured yet incredibly warm surface of the mud. He constantly mumbled to himself, actively attempting to decode the hidden engineering buried within those straw bales. Don Mateo, stirring from his famously light elder's sleep, simply parked himself right beside him in the pitch black and handed over the exact wisdom that Jebediah's textbooks had completely failed to teach him. Mateo laid it out in a perfectly measured tone, explaining that the pricey timber Jebediah utilized to throw up his palaces was certainly gorgeous, sure, but it essentially acted as a conduit. Solid lumber and heavily carved masonry openly allow the chill to travel straight through them, actively stealing the precious heat right out from the interior of those homes, much like a completely silent thief creeping around at night. However, the hay, that incredibly humble agricultural garbage the valley farmers had carelessly tossed into the rain, operated entirely differently. Mateo essentially taught Jebediah how to properly visualize the inner core of those compressed blocks, millions of entirely hollow stalks, trapping absolutely millions of stagnant air bubbles. That trapped air easily represents the absolute most formidable shield found in the natural world. The outdoor freeze, regardless of how insanely fierce it might get, simply cannot penetrate a solid wall composed of immobilized air. It hits a dead stop. It throws in the towel. Yet the sheer genius didn't even stop right there. That curved seating arrangement and the remarkably heavy layers of red clay essentially functioned exactly like a battery actively storing pure life force. Jebediah listened, utterly fascinated, while the elderly Hispanic fellow, without relying on a single complex math equation, flawlessly described the fundamental thermodynamic principle regarding specific heat. The blazing fast fire inside the metal drum rapidly heated up the clay. The earthen material happily absorbed that furious burst of energy and quickly tamed it, steadily releasing it over a 24-hour span in the form of deep, radiant heat waves. A type of warmth that absolutely didn't just heat up the ambient air only for it to vanish through the ceiling, but rather actively warmed the bodies, the very bones, and the blood of whoever happened to be sitting nearby. Reverend Blackwood, actively eavesdropping on this chat from the shadows, quietly broke down in tears. For his entire existence, he had openly preached that mankind was meant to subdue the earth, to actively dominate it, physically imposing our sheer will directly onto the mountains and valleys. He had constantly viewed Mother Nature as an enemy begging to be conquered, going so far as teaching his flock to erect massive walls fueled by pride right against her. However, sitting right there inside the belly of a dwelling, slapped together with mud and literal trash, he finally grasped that the Almighty hadn't placed mankind on this dirt just to wage war against it, but rather to actively listen to it. The sheer hubris involved in erecting Victorian mansions, featuring massive windows pointing due north, situated right in a valley constantly whipped by Arctic gales, certainly wasn't progress. It was nothing short of monumental blindness. When the massive thaw officially arrived toward the tail end of February, and the outdoor world finally began to drip, actively exposing the pure horrors the blizzard had temporarily buried, That heavy oak door swung wide open. Crisp, noticeably damp air immediately flooded the interior. All 14 survivors stepped out into the absolutely blinding glare of the sun, actively bouncing off the melting powder. What they immediately witnessed permanently altered them for the rest of their natural lives. The supposedly booming town of Esperanza essentially resembled a massive graveyard littered with splintered lumber and frost-bitten masonry. The main drags were completely choked with the frozen corpses of cattle, horses, and mules that simply couldn't withstand the absolutely vertical drop in the local mercury. The majestic, sprawling manor belonging to Silas Montgomery featured entirely caved-in rooflines, totally incapable of shouldering the monumental, crushing weight of the accumulated drifts. Every single expensive glass pane was totally shattered, leaving the interior of his palatial estate coated beneath a nasty layer of black ice and stagnant, freezing puddles. The ultra-luxury furnishings were totally ruined. The imported rugs were actively rotting away. Jebediah Cross's imposing stone fortress was technically still standing upright, but it basically amounted to a totally useless giant. The interior walls were completely soaked through with freezing condensation, steadily dripping much like some incredibly dreary cavern. It genuinely would have required several weeks of non-stop roaring fires just to dry that masonry out enough to make the quarters remotely livable again. Absolutely everything that human ego had slapped together across that valley, blatantly ignoring the fundamental laws of nature, had just been severely punished with a breathtaking level of brutality. And yet, as they trudged right back toward their respective ruins, they all happened to glance back over their shoulders. Up on that tiny crest, Don Mateo's dwelling sat remarkably tranquil. The incredibly heavy powder piled atop his earthen roof hadn't crushed it whatsoever. Instead, it had simply functioned as an extra layer of beneficial winter insulation. Now, with the sun beating down, that exterior mud was already beginning to dry out once again, hardening up, patiently bracing itself for the inevitable springtime showers. There wasn't a single stress crack, absolutely zero structural damage. The dirt had quite simply held the line. It had just patiently waited out the passing gale, exactly as it had successfully done for millions of years. The ultimate rebuilding of Esperanza was certainly not a fast process, but it genuinely represented the most completely silent and incredibly profound architectural revolution in the entire history of Colorado. Silas Montgomery, the very guy who used to casually size folks up based entirely on the thickness of their bank books, flatly refused to hire pricey New York architects to patch up his little empire. He hiked straight over to Don Mateo's plot, holding his hat securely in his hands with his head bowed, and pitched him a solid deal. Silas offered to supply the acreage, the workhorses, and all the required grub. Mateo would simply supply the wisdom. That ensuing spring, the wheat fields absolutely weren't torched right after harvest time. Silas issued strict orders to every single hired hand to scoop up, tightly bale, and dry out absolutely every last stalk of leftover hay available within county limits. Jebediah Cross shoved his fancy European blueprints deep into a desk drawer that he never bothered to pop open ever again. He totally ditched his tailored suits and gladly strapped on some heavily worn canvas work gear. Working strictly under Don Mateo's highly patient supervision, the seasoned carpenter officially learned how to stomp mud. He figured out how to physically read the texture of the wet clay, knowing exactly when it desperately needed an extra shovel of sand to avoid cracking, or when it required a solid dose of chopped hay just to gain some necessary flex. The Montgomery family's brand new residence definitely wasn't some soaring two-story mansion actively taunting the local gales. It was a sprawling, low-profile structure, pointed perfectly due south to actively harvest that low winter sunshine, featuring massive roof overhangs designed to shield the exterior from the punishing summer heat. The walls easily hit 3 feet in thickness. The heating elements consisted of absolutely enormous thermal mass benches cutting straight across the main living area, It was the kind of home that totally refused to impose its sheer will upon the landscape, instead looking exactly as if it had organically sprouted right out of it. The moment the next winter blasted through, packing that cruel signature Colorado chill, Silas Montgomery burned through barely a quarter of his usual firewood stash, happily strolling barefoot and in his shirt sleeves right across his parlor, dead in the middle of January. The overall impact rolling across the settlement was absolute. Reverend Blackwood officially began delivering an entirely different brand of sermon. He passionately discussed the sheer humility found in common mud. He highlighted how the Almighty had literally placed the answers right at our very toes, not locked away inside massive factories back east, but rather buried in the dust, hidden in the clay, and tangled up in the pasture grass we trample every day. The congregation, having just endured some incredibly horrific losses, actively listened, utilizing a totally fresh set of ears. They no longer viewed Don Mateo as the aging Mexican outcast banished by polite society. They actively saw him as the quiet guardian of a profound truth that they had casually abandoned during their frantic rush to become fully modern. Over the course of the ensuing 15 years, the architectural footprint across the entire region underwent a massive shift. Chunky walls and softened edges swiftly replaced those painfully sharp corners and paper-thin lumber partitions. Raw survival officially stopped acting like some brutal death match against the freezing cold, morphing instead into an incredibly elegant dance with the shifting seasons. Don Mateo aged incredibly gracefully, surrounded entirely by a settlement that highly revered him. The local youngsters, which definitely included the grandkids of the once incredibly haughty Silas Montgomery, happily sprinted across his acreage every summer, actively playing around, mashing up mud and tossing together tiny makeshift shelters. Mateo patiently taught them that hands completely filthy from digging in the dirt are honestly hands totally scrubbed clean of nasty pride. He spun tales about his very own grandparents, going out of his way to guarantee that the vital chain of knowledge, that highly fragile link tethering humanity straight to Mother Nature, would absolutely never snap again. When Don Mateo finally closed his eyes for the absolute last time, resting at the highly advanced age of 82, he certainly didn't expire in the bitter isolation reserved for an outcast. He passed away within a valley he had entirely overhauled, utilizing nothing more than the sheer horsepower of his own resilience. Every single soul in town showed up for his burial service. They definitely didn't put him in the ground inside some fancy imported mahogany casket, mostly because he'd previously laid out crystal-clear instructions. Silas and Jebediah, actively fighting back tears, personally threw together a remarkably cool and silent earthen vault, utilizing the exact same adobe bricks he had originally taught them how to slap together. They gladly handed him right back to the dirt, returning him to that massive maternal force that had constantly hugged him tight, that absolutely never judged him, and that eagerly supplied him with the exact tools required to thoroughly embarrass the supposedly smartest men on Earth. Our incredibly modern era has basically sold us an incredibly dangerous lie. Society has convinced us that fancy gadgets and deep bank accounts can somehow permanently insulate us from the raw fury packed by Mother Nature. We actively slap together massive glass skyscrapers right in the middle of scorching deserts, throw up paper-thin walls smack in the middle of hurricane alleys, and blow through incalculable fortunes, constantly trying to fight the weather, perpetually trying to heat up the chill and cool down the heat, utterly convinced that we operate as the undisputed rulers of this rock. Yet Don Mateo's legendary tale, stretching back to that brutal blizzard of 1899, functions as a distant booming echo, practically screaming at us to wake up. It serves as a totally ferocious reminder that genuine comfort and raw survival simply aren't items you can purchase with cold hard cash. Rather, they are thoroughly earned through deep respect, incredibly quiet observation, and a truly profound level of reverence regarding the unbending rules governing the natural world. Mother Earth absolutely does not discriminate. A raging blizzard never stops to ask if you've got a vault stuffed full of gold bars, if you hold fancy Ivy League degrees, or if you happen to run a massive congregation. The natural world only ever asks one single question whenever it unleashes its full wrath. Are you genuinely prepared? And that level of readiness extremely rarely stems from pure ego. It heavily stems from collective memory. It comes strictly from actively remembering exactly how the folks who stood here long before us managed to scrape by, those ancestors who entirely lacked heavy machinery or bottomless tanks of fuel. The very people who managed to endure for thousands of years, utilizing absolutely nothing more than common mud, dried hay, river rocks, and some totally unbreakable ingenuity. Massive ego operates as humanity's most totally silent assassin. It consistently masquerades as pure progress. It constantly disguises itself as elite social status. It actively forces us to sneer at anything remotely simple while openly mocking the humble. It tricks us into branding true visionaries as absolute lunatics and tossing the label of primitive onto genuinely wise folks. However, the exact second those gales start shrieking, right when the frost shatters the panes and the timber officially buckles, your pride is always the very first thing to freeze solid and violently snap into a million tiny pieces. Legends, much like this specific valley getting completely bailed out by an aging outcast, manage to actively hand us back our fading hope. They vividly prove that human beings harbor an absolutely incredible capacity to course correct, to aggressively swallow their own pride, to glean tough lessons from totally botched mistakes, and to fundamentally alter their lifestyle just to groove perfectly with their local environment. Don Mateo's ultimate triumph certainly wasn't some petty act of revenge. It amounted to a masterclass in pure love, directed right toward the concept of life itself. If you feel deep down in your gut that this overly frantic society desperately needs to tap the brakes and reflect upon these deeply ancient truths, if peering into the stubborn tenacity shown by Don Mateo allows you to spot the distinct reflection of the raw grit, the quiet humility, and the totally unshakable faith held by your very own parents and grandparents, then please don't allow this incredible tale to simply vanish back into the winds of history. Go ahead and drop a like to actively support the lasting memory of those ancestors who managed to hold the line. Make sure to hit subscribe on this channel because our absolute mission remains, and forever will be, actively digging up the deeply buried grit of our forefathers. Please share this specific account with your own family. Pass it along to your kids, or hand it to anybody who might occasionally feel totally beaten down simply because they lack heavy material wealth. Basically, just to remind them that raw ingenuity paired with deep humility actively erects massive fortresses that piles of cash could never possibly knock over. Because every once in a while, the absolute best fix for our highly modern emergencies doesn't involve constantly staring forward, hunting for increasingly expensive gadgets, but instead simply glancing straight downward, right at the very dirt we stomp on every single day, and remembering that it already holds absolutely every single answer we could ever possibly require. Never, ever let anyone brand you as a lunatic just for actively honoring your deeply buried roots, because when the tempest finally rolls out, that profoundly ancient wisdom usually stands as the absolute last sanctuary remaining completely upright.